Hi, my name is Josh White, and this is Globalists, the new podcast from the Battleground. This week, we're discussing Germany's failed bid to rejoin the UN Security Council. Joining me is my co-host Mitchell Plitnick, and our first ever guest today, Wieland Hoban, author of Germany's Jewish Problem. Wieland is a Anglo-German composer and translator based in Frankfurt. He is also the chairman of Jewish Voice for a Just Peace in the Middle East.
So, just a really quick note. This is Wieland's book, Germany's Jewish Problem, which I was proud to write the afterword for. So please run out and buy it. It's really good. Um, the the failure of Germany to secure a seat this time on the UN Security Council has had profound impact on Germany's international standing, or at least it's a reflection of what has happened to Germany's international standing. And it's also had some pretty profound effects domestically within German politics. And it's really great that we have Wieland here to discuss. There's been a lot of speculation as to why Germany lost. I think it's indisputable that its absolute support of Israel's genocide was a big mark against it. I do think there were some other factors, particularly Germany's reduction in international aid, which I think did not win it many friends among the General Assembly, which is who votes for the UN, the rotating UN Security Council seats. That is that's part of it. Other people think it has to do with Russia campaigning against Germany because of its support for Ukraine. I'm a bit dubious about that because the European countries that got elected, Austria and Portugal, are also very supportive of Ukraine. Of course, not so much as Germany. Germany has been the leader in Europe in supporting Ukraine. And except I just don't know that Russia is that concerned about that, but maybe they are. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Wieland, that's why we're here to talk to you.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on the show. Um, I think before one even gets into all the questions about why and what are the consequences and what's the background, I think one just has to take in the overwhelming symbolism of the scene when the result with the votes was being read out, because obviously it was read out by the president, who is Annalena Baerbock, and she was previously the foreign minister of Germany. And of course, as a member of that government, she was, by definition, complicit in Germany's role in the genocide. But she also became particularly notorious during that time for a speech in the German parliament, the Bundestag, in which she said that schools and hospitals lose their protected status if there are, I believe she said, terrorists hiding inside. So, regurgitating the usual Hamas human shields talking point. And I mean, the clip of that just went viral again and again. And I think practically every time she's mentioned, it gets shared again. And so if we consider that she was the one who now reads out the votes, and then, after Portugal and Austria and lots of applause, then in this slightly embarrassed voice, just over 100 votes for Germany. I mean, how can that not be poetic justice? I mean, so many people just felt an immense satisfaction to see her personally humiliated in that way for her role in all of this. And I mean, she was disgraceful, not just that speech, also another one in which she claimed it was a kind of, I suppose in the US, you'd call it a sort of town hall event, or maybe something a bit more public, even where there was, an audience could ask questions. And she just brazenly claimed that she had seen a video of Hamas militants raping Israeli women. No such video exists. No Secret Service has such a video. She was lying. It was a barefaced lie, and she was never called to account. And so it was already outrageous enough that she got this promotion to New York, to the UN, And then, this just, I mean, we're really living in ridiculous times. Even if it doesn't have the kind of grotesque characteristics of Trump land, there's still something just really, really outlandish about it all. And the aid factor, I don't know so much about that. For some countries, maybe it was significant, but I think that's not something that has the kind of global fame. Germany's participation in the genocide, and I say participation, it's not just support, they really participated. Those tanks couldn't have run without German technology. That is known throughout the world. Everybody knows that Germany supported the genocide. And I think, this is just such a clear payback for that.
Is there also there's also, I think, the aspect of the hypocrisy, right? Which has really played out powerfully, I think, in the United States. This idea that we have rallied against Russia's war crimes against Ukraine and all of the, this was such a, I mean, you just see Ukrainian flags here in the States everywhere. Not as much as when the war started 4 years ago, but it's still it's still a thing. And then a complete blind eye. Not just a blind eye, but complete support, in fact, for Israeli war crimes. I suspect that a similar accusation of hypocrisy is dogging Germany.
Well, undoubtedly. I mean, they just made a mockery of any sense of humanitarian law. This so-called rules-based order, because there are different approaches. What we have now is this, to me, in a sense, refreshing Trumpian approach where there's no pretense of caring about the law. He doesn't say we're bringing democracy to the Middle East, we're bringing freedom to Venezuela. He just says, okay, I'm the boss and I'll do what I want. Whereas Biden was still in the school of liberal imperialism, where you pretend that there's a kind of moral narrative to it all. So yeah, the hypocrisy, but also, I mean, since you bring up Ukraine, that's been really the whole Ukraine issue has been the site of the militarization discourse, and then the concrete militarization measures in Germany. We're talking about budgets that would have been unimaginable a few years ago. And just saying one day, Olaf Scholz, who was chancellor at the time, saying, okay, we're suddenly opening up a new budget of 100 billion euros, for arms, and then talking about bringing back the draft. And, in a sort of two-stage thing, there's this slightly kind of dishonest thing saying, okay, first there's going to be a voluntary draft. But, presumably that then is the prelude to the involuntary draft. And, and then you've had some of these crazy warmongering politicians in the last couple of years saying things like, we must be prepared to give our lives for Israel. So, if you combine the two things, military service and dying for Israel, then you get some pretty scary results. And the same with Ukraine, obviously, and the idea of Germans having to die in Ukraine or for Ukraine is something that's also been going around a lot in discourse about this. And Germany is saying that they want to have the biggest European army by 2039, and there's this just very obvious phenomenon here of Germany really wanting to be great again. And that I suspect that some of that UN humiliation may also have been a response to that. This feeling that, okay, Germany basically wants, is trying to get on the way to conquering the world after this disgraceful performance with Gaza. And so someone has to do something about it.
What strikes me about all this is I don't know if irony is the right phrase for it, but the important role that Israel has played for Germany as a kind of, well, for German governments as a kind of like morality car wash post World War II. Our support for Zionism means that we are part of the civilized world and so on. And yet, it's actually the kind of gateway back to militarism, or part of it, with regard to Ukraine. Um, it's just something that struck my mind.
Yeah, definitely. Well, there is a kind of, I mean, it's a kind of circular motion that, if one sort of believes in kind of philosophy of history with its cycles and directions, there is something almost uncanny about it. That Israel, as you say, and I mean, this is something, of course, that I also talk about in my book, is it was a way to get back into onto the stage, the international stage, as a respectable major power. And the Zionists have always been pragmatic. So in the end, they don't care who the support is coming from, whether it's German ex-Nazis or American evangelical Christians who, want to damn them to hell once the second coming of Jesus happens. And the idea that this sort of ticket to political redemption after the not only defeat in World War II, but also this very shameful image, as this monster of a country, just this murderous monster, and this caricature of Germans just as these inhuman, emotionless creatures, who would often just be insulted in the street if they showed their faces in other countries for a while. The fact that the route that they chose in order to get out of all of this, with Israel as the ticket, the fact that that has led them all the way back to the sort of militarism that preceded World War II is, I mean, it's I don't know. What do you say? It's kind of mind-boggling if you think about it, really. And I mean, the same way you could say, I mean, obviously very different roles, but what's often pointed out with Israel, the kind of reversal of victim and perpetrator, that so shortly after the Holocaust, where Jews were victimized in the most brutal way possible, that then Jews had in turn become perpetrators in Palestine. That again, a kind of reversal, very different phenomena, but I still think that they just showed how the developments taken by history can have a dynamic of their own that only really gains its full horror at a slight remove.
That sort of leads into, at least in my mind, the question of the reverberations of this defeat at the UN domestically in Germany, where, from what I've seen, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm just an American, um, the the current leader, the current leader in polls in Germany is the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, and this coalition right now seems to be weakening, and this defeat seems to have piled onto that. Are we? Can we soon? Do we have the potential to soon possibly be writing the narrative that Germany's myopic support for Israel and its genocidal actions have actually brought a neo-Nazi government back to Germany? Is that something that is possibly on the horizon?
Well, I wouldn't really draw a connection between this UN debacle and the popularity of the AfD because, generally the AfD and their base are less concerned with international relations
Yeah.
than
No,
with
I
national
wasn't suggesting a
issues.
connection so much as I was suggesting that they were already gaining a lot of popularity, and this being something that shows this current coalition as just another element in its weakness. And that the AfD have talked about, their spokespeople have talked about how this made Germany look stupid on the world stage. That's obviously just political. It's not. I'm not trying to connect those two things.
Hmm.
I'm just wondering if the failure of this government might lead the AfD into power.
Well, I would say the failure of this government and the last government, just on many levels, are what will lead the AfD to power. And it's just so obvious how Chancellor Merz has tried to. I mean, it's just always the same thing again and again. Mimicking far right talking points. We see it in the UK with Starmer trying to keep up with the far right as well. It's when the center, or even if it's, let's say, the center right, um, when they think that they can get the votes from the far right voters if they say things that are racist enough. And that's something that even the SPD was doing. The previous chancellor, Olaf Scholz, had said in 2023, at the kind of the height of this sort of anti-Muslim sentiment after October 7th, he had said that we're going to have to deport on a grand scale. And the whole Palestine, Islamophobia, deportation discourse, that's really been fueled by pretty much all parties, and that's something that the AfD have ultimately benefited from, because I think we all know that when you get the center, even the conservative center, echoing far right talking points, it doesn't make them more attractive. It just normalizes those talking points. And so it kind of confirms them, because then the actual AfD voters, they don't feel like Nazis anymore, because it seems like, okay, well, everyone is saying this. So what's the big deal? And people, I think people are really just emboldened by the increasing normalization of this discourse. They feel fewer inhibitions about just showing their racism openly in public.
How has the German Jewish community responded to that? It seems like, I mean, I know the AfD's targets have much more been Muslims and immigrants, but and then there's we needn't delve into the history of the Jewish community in Germany right now, but now contemporaneously, how does that, what you just described, that whole dynamic, how is that being dealt with by the German Jewish community?
Well, I guess it always depends what one means by, the Jewish community. There are its official representatives in the form of the individual religious communities, and then as the umbrella for all that, the Central Council of Jews, which is a very right-wing organization,
Yeah.
really, similar to the Board of Deputies in the UK, but maybe, I don't know, maybe even further to the right, sometimes think. And, it's like officially, because the common wisdom is that the AfD are far right, and far right is traditionally anti-Semitic, and so it's not good to support the AfD. Okay, they will sort of pay lip service to that. But some of the things they say are indistinguishable from things the AfD says. They'll refer to Palestine demonstrations, talking about the barbarians roaming the streets, endangering Jews. And, and the newspaper, which, obviously the Central Council of Jews is state funded. And so their newspaper is also state funded. And, it's the same sort of gutter level as the Jewish Chronicle in the UK. Maybe if you want to learn about Jewish holidays and stuff, it's informative. But as far as the political commentary goes, it's abysmal. It's really just, it could be an AfD newspaper, basically.
Mm.
It's saying there are no civilians in Gaza. All the Muslims in Germany are Hamas and should be deported. It's really at that level. Even when it's written in a more let's say, respectable style by some of the authors, that is really just the ideological level that it has. So to the extent that one takes that as expressing what the so-called Jewish community stands for, then it's, yeah, basically AFD values just without the label. And what's sad is that you do also see this mirrored on the ground when you have, let's say the official communities, so like sort of synagogue-based communities, when you have maybe their representatives claiming in public speeches that at demonstrations people are saying death to the Jews, just complete fabrications. And then you might have the mayor of Frankfurt sort of nodding with a worried look on his face while some Jewish representative makes this utterly false claim. Or one pretty memorable event from last November. It was on 9th November, so the anniversary of the November pogroms of 1938. And at the biggest synagogue in Frankfurt, there was a commemoration event, and they'd invited Jason Stanley, the Jewish American philosopher and fascism specialist, to give a speech. And in the course of his speech, he also came around to the topic of Israel and mentioned the fact that, even among Jews, there are different opinions. And his own parents, for example, had opposing opinions. And there were people like Hannah Arendt, etc. And just in the middle of these deliberations, he was shouted down by people from the community who were just outraged by this. And eventually he was hounded out of the synagogue. He's leave by a side door. And then the next day there was just a short hateful statement on the website of the community saying, we utterly distance ourselves from this man. And I'm just thinking, what kind of scenes are these? And then on some other day they invite an IDF tank commander to talk about the situation in Israel. And so a number of comrades and I, we use that as an occasion to protest right in front of the community venue that was being used for that. These things have become normalized. So it becomes very difficult in such situations to say, one shouldn't hold Jews responsible for what Israel does, etc. But when you just have this kind of this crass support just for the worst things that are being done by Israel, that's a hard line to maintain.
It's very similar in the UK, though it's much harsher in Germany, I think. I mean, we have a similar kind of parallel reality that the media has created, or certain parts of the media at least, where peace marchers are treated as hate marchers, and it's just kind of casually talked about as if, yeah, there's demonstrations for Palestine. That's all anti-Semitism, all of it. But it's been much more oppressive in Germany, and we now have the very bleak prospect of a change of government in the near future, where the AfD will be part of a coalition. I'm guessing that their line will be to build on that repression further.
Yeah, at the moment they still use this this linking of philo-Semitism and Islamophobia to pretend that they're looking out for the interests of Jews by calling for the deportation of Muslims. So they go along with that, but obviously a far-right party and its base are going to be full of people who are anti-Semitic in one way or another. And I mean, yeah, we see in other countries as well as in what Israeli politicians themselves do, that anti-Semitism itself, as a hostility towards actual Jewish people for who they are, is less bothersome to them than anti-Zionism, or even something milder than anti-Zionism, just a kind of critical stance towards Israel, without questioning the premise, its premise itself. And yeah, the far right will use any excuse to pursue their racist agenda, and if Jews are one useful tool in that, then they're going to use that and pretend to be our friends. And that's why it's also so depressing, but also enraging then to see just these Jewish communities going along with that. And I mean, in the UK, of course, you also have I guess you could say, the added spice that one of the leading politicians most critical of Israel and most willing to condemn the genocide, Zach Polanski, is himself Jewish. And you can see how that's not doing him all that much good against the smears, really, is it? I mean, it's not like he gets a free ride because of that. Because Mitchell, I'm sure you know this as well as, or even better than I do, since you've been in the game maybe a bit longer, is that, when Zionists want to attack Jews who are not Zionists or who are anti-Zionists, then, one way to do it is just by unjewing us, then we don't count. Then, we're not actually Jews. We're just pretending, and I see this happening with Polanski, of course. Whether you go for the sort of traitor narrative, the capo, or whether just saying, oh, he didn't grow up this or that way, or, he's not really that, or just trying to discredit, because, of course, the argument itself with human rights, etc., that's a bit harder to discredit. And so these things, I mean, as you say, they appear in various countries, in various settings, with different details, but it's something that ultimately is going to happen wherever a state is part of Western imperialism, because Israel is a tool of Western imperialism, a weapon of Western imperialism. And so that's why the official state narrative, which these Jewish organizations have to follow if they want to maintain the influence that they have, then that is the politics that we'll see. Because these I mean, it's almost an exaggeration to call them elites, because their influence, their status is pretty limited. But in the context of the Jewish community, if we call the Central Council or the Board of Deputies the elites, they only have the influence that they do by virtue of towing the state line and supporting Israel. So if the Board of Deputies suddenly became anti-Zionist overnight, well, there goes their budget. They would no longer be of use to the government.
It's interesting that you bring up Zach Polanski, because there is this sort of dual track that's happened to him in the UK. I think one is exactly the one you mentioned, this sort of de-Judaizing of him, saying he's not a real Jew because he's not Zionist. And then there's the other side of it where he's been subject to anti-Semitic slurs. Some of the
Right.
cartoon images of him, and I see that happening from the right quite a bit. We saw this a few years ago. Yair Netanyahu, the son of Israel's prime minister, was spreading the most vile anti-Semitic stuff. It was about Soros and it was about the left. But it was all these classic, I mean, straight out of Der Stürmer images, um, and it's sort of stunning to me how they will use both of those edges. And I mean, I react a little bit differently to it because of my personal background, being raised Orthodox and being educated into high school, at least in yeshiva. So it's a little hard to tell me I'm not Jewish, and that I don't come to my views in an honest way. And there's many more Jews who are like that, and I think there's also a growing Jewish dynamic that supports it. But I want to sort of bring us back a little bit to this UN ruling, uh, or decision, the vote, and just to ask. I mean, it's not so long ago, although it seems like an eon ago, that the Iran nuclear deal was worked out. And who was it worked out by? It was worked out by what was called the P5+1. There's five
Mhm.
permanent members of the Security Council plus Germany. Germany was the plus one. Germany was the one party on the Western side that was working that deal out, that was not a permanent member of the Security Council. That said something about Germany's status, I think, at least in the Western eyes, the neoliberal, in a sense, eyes of the Obama administration. How that all, they I think it was indisputable, at least in the West, that Germany was playing a very prominent role, and I think that's come into question now. I'm certainly seeing it being questioned, in a lot of diplomatic areas. And I guess what I would like to hear from you, Wieland, is just your own point of view. Is that maybe a better thing? Is it better that Germany, uh, given where it's gone with its apparent international status in the 21st century, uh, is it better that its role is maybe reduced, or is that an issue? Should it be trying to claim that and maybe act in a more positive? I mean, what would you like to see Germany be doing on an international in the international arena?
A good question. I suppose I don't often think of what I would actually want Germany to do. More think more about what it should stop doing. And I mean, it's interesting that you bring up Iran and the nuclear deal, given the current or recent situation in Iran, where of course Germany, we went from just a sort of knee-jerk support of Trump to then, after basically the whole world had concluded that it was a very bad idea, then saying, "Oh yes, well, it was a pretty bad idea."
Yeah.
I mean, it just shows the utter lack of vision or leadership that Merz has. That he only catches up with the rest of the world, a week later or even more, after reflexively just parroting Trump. Um, and without going too far in praising Merkel, at least she was operating in a different way, it has to be said. Like deciding to let in refugees from Syria and Iraq that many of her party comrades, the conservatives, did not want
Yeah.
in Germany. And then, Germany being a major player in the detente with Iran. It's I mean, I would say that at the moment, seeing what a harmful direction Germany is going in, I would say the less influence it has, the better. But then, that doesn't change things getting worse domestically. And I guess, Germany for a long time has not been a country that initiates aggression. It's been one that, in certain situations, will join in with the aggression, as in Gaza or Iran, actually, where, despite not appearing to be a party in the war, the Ramstein air base in Germany was central to the functioning of the U.S. Air Force. They basically couldn't have done a lot of the things that they did without using that German air base. So that means, I think, to anyone who looks at it reasonably, that Germany is taking part in that war. And of course, leaving aside the issue of arming Israel, which is obviously always there. Um, so yeah, I mean, Germany, the only way Germany could do more good is by doing less harm. And and some things like the airbase, those have been picked up, of course, by the peace movement here, by the anti-militarism movement, saying things like, close Ramstein airbase, or at least don't let the Americans use it. But yeah, these are not struggles that are going to be won tomorrow.
It just brings to mind again how relevant your book is, frankly. There's this kind of conversation that's kind of locked out of the mainstream. And yes, well, that's why we're here, I suppose. That's why we're having this conversation. Do you want to say a bit more about your book to finish on?
Yeah, well, some of it feels very long ago because it's a collection of articles written between 2020 and 2024. And if one's been deeply involved in all the whole activity of the Palestine movement since October 7th, then even that feels like a long time. And so everything before October 7th, it feels like, I don't know, it feels like a decade ago or something. So what's actually been interesting to me is revisiting some of these older texts and sort of remembering sort of where the world was back then. And just recently, I had my first reading event here in Frankfurt, actually in an Irish pub, which was a very cozy sort of venue. And reading some of these old texts again, I was thinking, oh yeah, back then it was things were not quite as extreme in various ways. And these threads in the end, they all come together, just as we said that this thing that initially started as a ticket back to respectability, supporting Israel, which was of course sold as this moral narrative of redemption from historical guilt, how that led directly to the most egregious kind of military crimes. And just seeing the way that played out in domestic politics. And I think one characteristic of the book, you might say, is that it's of different scales. So there might be things which seem maybe a bit trivial, like, I don't know, tweets from politicians or officials, and then contextualized, in relation to historical arcs that are much wider than that, or petty scandals, but then contextualized in the history of post-war Germany, these sorts of things. So that's what I hope would be interesting for readers, that these things are brought together, which are maybe not so obvious, connections that they hadn't made themselves. And the last article in it, aside from the introduction, is from late 2024, which already feels pretty long ago, and it's called 1 Year of Genocide. And of course, it's now been 2.5 years, more than 2.5 years of genocide. And it seems like the end is just not in sight. It's become the normal state. That's, who of us would have imagined that genocide, aside from this very slow creeping genocide, of the ongoing Nakba, that one could describe that way, who would have thought that this would just be the status quo?
It shows that it's an epochal event, truly. Mitchell, do you want to have a final word?
I just would, I just think it's really striking, the notion of the ongoing genocide in Gaza, and also reading that as just a continuation, perhaps a culmination in some ways, of the Nakba. We're going on what 59 years now, that this I'm sorry, 79 years. I just I
Yeah.
can't even do the math in my head. It's so horrifying. And the idea, the notion that Israel, which was a false notion, it's not true that Israel grew out of the Holocaust. Zionism long predates that. Certainly, the Holocaust accelerated the creation of the state, I think. Um, but the Zionist movement was making steady progress before that. But the notion that Israel grew out of the Holocaust, and then that Germany in particular had to atone for the Holocaust by creating another genocide. Uh, there's something so perverse in that, and yet so distinctly modern Western human, in that sort of political thinking. It is really, really stunning, and I think Germany, in so many ways, is an object lesson. Germany was an object lesson before World War II. The defeat of Germany in World War One and the way we, the Allied powers, handled that victory post World War One led directly to World War Two. It led to the rise of the Nazi Party. There's a lot that came out of the end of World War II that should have been positive. That should have been things that were real step forwards. The creation of these international systems, the United Nations, international, a body of international humanitarian law. So much of that should have been positive, and its application, being so biased, has completely undermined it and turned it into something grotesque.
Right,
So
but that's been going on for decades.
that
I
has
mean,
absolutely,
Korea,
exactly,
Vietnam, that was all after the
exactly. All
UN.
of that's part of that. All of that is part of it's not limited in any way to Israel, and our dealings in the Middle East. It's global. But I think Germany is the site of where you can see a lot of it playing out, or playing out on top of it. And it's fine that, and it's all well and good that Germany has faced a certain consequence here in its failure to rejoin the Security Council. And I do think that says something about Germany's how it's being seen in the rest of the world,
Yeah, definitely.
particularly in the global South, where I think a lot of the shift happened. In terms of, although who knows, because it's a secret ballot, we don't know for sure. But yeah, I think that with the way we're addressing these things, um, maybe this is a sign that the global South is having more of a voice, and maybe this is a sign that a different way of doing things is on the horizon. Hopefully, it turns out better than the last one.
Well, the fact that South Africa um, embarked on the lawsuit against Israel for genocide was, of course, very symbolic in that regard. The
Yeah.
global South kind of leading, at least in that regard, leading the way. I mean, the fact that they're still selling coal to Israel is another matter, but at least at that symbolic level. Or then Nicaragua suing Germany for complicity in genocide, these kinds of things. Definitely.
Yeah, all of this is, well, it's an indictment of a system and its history, as I increasingly think about it, what's going on. And on that note, that's all for this week. Thank you for listening. This has been Globalists.